Hi, my name's John Walker from Fairtrade International, and I'm the Senior Advisor for Cocoa. I'm delighted to be here today to talk with you about the most significant change for smallholders and the rest of the chocolate and cocoa industry that we've seen in many, many years, the EU deforestation regulation. Forests must be protected through legislation, but that legislation must include fairness and social justice, especially when we consider that many smallholders are living in poverty or extreme poverty. At Fairtrade, we're committed to work with all stakeholders to address the causes of deforestation, increase farmers' access to the resources and tools to manage deforestation risk, and address the biodiversity crisis, while advocating for, running programs for, and making progress towards living income. During this presentation, I'm going to look at how fair trade standards complement the EU deforestation regulation and promote sharing the burden of the regulation more fairly, and how our programs complement both our own certification and the regulation, bringing benefits to farmers, the environment, and companies that rely on the farmers that supply their cocoa. So, first, let's compare fair trade standards and the EU deforestation regulation. It's important to say that the regulation is very clear. Certification cannot be the equivalent of compliance with the regulation. However, it can contribute to the risk analysis of the regulation. Also, no certification can guarantee that there is zero deforestation. However, we think we have a robust structure, an assessment and management process for the risk of deforestation in the fair trade standards. Both the EU deforestation and fair trade have the same definition of deforestation. Fair trade has an earlier cut-off date by 2 years than the regulation, so it's more strict than the regulation. And we have the same requirements for farmers on geolocation data of farms. Our standards then go further than the EU deforestation regulation. Fair trade requires co-ops assess, manage, and mitigate risk of deforestation, and traders support cooperatives to do that. Our experience tells us that it's very important to focus on the first mile, that space between the farm and the cooperative, and co-ops must assess the risk of fair trade and non-fair trade cocoa mixing and then address that risk. Co-ops put in place digital solutions to record the cocoa from their farmer to the cooperative, and we then have another layer of fairness through the fair trade minimum price, which is the vital safety net for farmers when prices crash, and the fair trade premium, which provide resources for the cooperative and their members to invest in their own needs. So, looking at our programs and how the programs complement both the standard and the regulation. Geolocation data is critical both for the fair trade standard and for the EU deforestation regulation. But cooperatives must have the tools to collect and manage that geolocation data. In 2021, we partnered with an organisation called FarmForce, piloting the introduction of digital management systems in Ivorian cooperatives. In 2022 and 2023, we rolled out the support of German and French governments to more cooperatives, and these systems enable the cooperatives to collect that critical geolocation data, but also other data like purchasing data from their farmers, training records, the distribution of inputs, and much, much more. So these systems bring efficiency and benefits to the business of the cooperatives and their members, as well as bringing benefits to the cooperatives' commercial partners. We combined access to these systems with support on purchasing the phones for collecting data for the cooperatives and training reaching hundreds of cooperative staff and their members. We do this because we believe that co-ops must own their own data and benefit from that data. We'd like to do this with many more cooperatives and would welcome partners to support so that we can work with those cooperatives and provide them access to the system, tools, and training to implement the systems. Our next program sees us working with another expert organisation. Geolocation data collected by co-ops is shared with expert satellite deforestation monitoring organisation Sat Intelligence. Sat Intelligence use their systems to provide reports to cooperatives on risk of potential deforestation events on or near their members' farms. These reports belong to the cooperative, giving them access to valuable risk monitoring data, and the cooperatives can share these reports with who they like. Potential deforestation events on co-ops members' farms must be acted on as defined in our standards. The report and the co-op's response is checked by our independent assurance provider of Fairtrade, FlowCert, during audit on Fairtrade standards. Providing this risk data to co-ops is funded by Fairtrade in collaboration with SAT Intelligence. Our aim is to provide this data to all Fairtrade cocoa and coffee cooperatives, and we would welcome support in doing that. Restricting access to EU markets will not lead to sustainable cocoa or the biodiversity crisis. Fairtrade works in partnerships to improve farmer livelihoods, including their resilience to climate change, increasing biodiversity in their ecosystems. In our Sankofa project with Swiss Co-op, Halber, Swiss Platform for Sustainable Cocoa, the Swiss and Finnish development agencies, Max Havelaar Switzerland, Fairtrade Africa, International Trade Centre, and Kwapa Cocoa Farmers Union Ghana is an excellent example of this. The project works with 3,500 farmers, reaching 17,000 community members, pursuing a holistic living income approach. The project intends to create access to conditions for dynamic agroforestry and food agroforestry systems to scale, and farmers take the sustainability of their business and their ecosystems into their own hands. The co-op delivers training on diversification combined with building the markets for the diversified crop. The project has also introduced Village Savings and Loans Association, a way of creating self-managed, self-capitalized savings groups. There are 30 of these groups in the Sankofa project, with 30 members in each group. A bank loan in Ghana would be between 35 to 40% for the members of these associations. The association itself makes loans to its members at 5 to 10% interest, so you can see the huge advantage that these associations have. The Sankofa project also includes payment of the Fairtrade Living Income Reference Price. The Living Income Reference Price is based on consultation with farmers, taking into account their local conditions, and it indicates the price that's needed by a farmer with a typical household size, a viable farm size, and sustainable production to earn a living income. And living income is absolutely critical, and it's critical to sustainable cocoa because the living income enables access to the basic human rights that we all have. So decent housing, clothing, nutritious diet, access to education, and to medical provision. So, in summary, Fairtrade standards complement the EU deforestation regulation through the same definition, a cut-off date which is 2 years earlier, so stricter than the regulation, alignment on the geolocation requirements in the Fairtrade standard with the regulation, and the standard then goes further than the regulation and introduces fairness. It requires co-ops to assess, manage, and mitigate the risk of deforestation with support from their trader partners, and focus on the non-mixing of fair trade cocoa and non-fair trade cocoa in that first mile between the farm and the cooperative, and address any risk of mixing. An additional layer of fairness is added through the fair trade minimum price, which is the vital safety net when prices crash, and the fair trade premium, which provides resources to cooperatives to act on their own needs. Our programs support cooperatives through the tools and the capacity which are available to manage geolocation data and ensure co-ops have access and ownership to the vital satellite deforestation risk monitoring data, which they can share with whoever they want, helping them to secure market access. We work with partners to move beyond monitoring for deforestation to improve farmers' livelihoods, increasing their climate change resilience and the biodiversity of their ecosystems. And farmers are going to need support to meet the EU deforestation regulation, but sustainable cocoa is only going to be achieved when farmers and their families are reaching a living income. So let's work on this together. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John, for joining us here at Confectionery Live and for sharing some insights. Why did you want to talk about this topic with us today?
I wanted to talk about EU deforestation regulation because, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, I really think this is the biggest change that we're seeing to trade for cocoa smallholders and the rest of the cocoa industry for many, many years, as long as I can remember. And this regulation, I mean, it is critical to protect forests with regulation, but they do need to include fairness and social justice. Now, we're hurtling towards the implementation date of the regulation, and I think it's pretty clear that not all farmers are going to be ready to comply with the regulation. So it's very important to raise awareness within the industry at events like this, of the regulation and the impact it's going to have on farmers and the support that farmers are going to need to meet the regulation.
Thank you. At the start of your presentation, what struck me is talking about how you've set the standards that you said the regulation is outlining far before the regulation came into play. Were you anticipating something like the EDR regulation coming into force?
So we have a part of Fairtrade which is dedicated to advocacy through Fairtrade Advocacy Office based in Brussels. And our Fairtrade Advocacy Office, with another number of other NGOs interested in smallholders, followed the development of the regulation very closely. Fairtrade International and Fairtrade Advocacy Office were part of the informal due diligence on cocoa with companies like Mars, Ferrero, etc. So we were advocating for the regulation. We were keeping a close eye on how it was developing, but also advocating for fairness and social justice to be included, which the regulation has got some way to, but there is a pretty significant gap, in my opinion. So we were aware of its development. We were tracking its development. And when the drafts of the regulation came forward, we were including that in the consultation for our new standards. So we were talking to fair trade cooperatives and their members. We were talking to industry. We were talking to civil society, and trying to work through how do we incorporate this into the fair trade standard.
I think, with mention to this gap, you seeing a gap, do you think there are any areas of the regulation that need clarifying based on your experience of setting these kinds of standards?
Yeah, so, well, I think there are two questions there, and they're great questions, Caitlin. What needs clarifying and where the gap is? And what needs clarifying at the moment, I would say, is the requirement that cocoa imported to the EU is legal in the country of production. Now, that can cover a huge scope of laws. So a tighter definition of what legality is, I think, would help all supply chain actors. What's the focus of the regulation outside of deforestation and protected areas? In relation to the gap, I think the huge gap that the regulation had is that, and it starts from the European Commission not doing a proper analysis on the impact of the regulation on smallholders, is the regulations not completely clear on who pays for the implementation of the regulation. And the risk always is that the costs of implementation are eventually passed down the supply chain to the farmers. And it doesn't make the link between the need for halting deforestation, for more sustainable cocoa, and farmers earning a living income. So we know the regulation is going to add layers of cost, whether it's at government level, whether it's at cooperative level, whether it's at importer or exporter level. However, none of that money is going to filter through down to the farm gate price for farmers. And that's how we achieve sustainable cocoa, when farmers earn a decent price for their cocoa and can reach a living income. And I think that is a really big gap in the regulation.
So, of course, talking about the farmers is so important. We have to keep them in mind. How important is establishing good relationships with the farmers and some of the co-ops that you spoke about in the presentation?
Well, that's at the heart of fair trade. That's what fair trade's all about. Long-term relationships between cooperatives, their members, and their buyers of cocoa. Now, I think something good that could come out of the regulation is that you would think that the buyers from cooperatives are even more keen to set up these long-term relationships with cooperatives, really develop relationships with them, understanding where the cocoa is coming from, the risk of deforestation, and how they work together to mitigate the risk of deforestation. So I think that's something positive which can come out of the regulation. I really hope, and unfortunately, because the regulation doesn't mandate it at the moment, it has to be based on hope and on goodwill, that these relationships include ensuring that farmers can reach a living income.
Definitely. Finally, John, what struck me as well, you spoke about a biodiversity crisis. Could you talk about this and why it's it poses a threat to having a more sustainable cocoa industry?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very, very good and clear example. There is an issue with the density of natural pollinators in Ghana, and there is a program now of hand pollination of cocoa flowers to produce the cocoa pod. I mean, clearly this isn't sustainable, right? We need to move back to a place where we have natural pollinators thriving in ecosystems, and we have thriving ecosystems for farmers and their communities.
Well, thank you so much, John, for speaking to me and for highlighting some of those crucial points. And we really appreciate you joining us here at Confectionery Live.
Thank you, Caitlin.